now it's time for Reverend Gary Batey, who's a frequent visitor here since he retired from Roser on the beach, and we just love having him here and hear what he says. If you give him a warm welcome, please.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back here. My goodness, what a crowd. There must be, well, there's more than 1 million people, I'm sure. Great to see so many. And Eleonora, what beautiful, beautiful music. And man, the way your fingers go, you must be able to tweet a mile a minute. Wow. That's fabulous. Well, it's always a pleasure to be back with you. It gives me a chance to remind myself how to tie a tie, because I don't wear one for anything else. But it's great to be with you and to share with you on what is the first Sunday of the season, the church year, that's called Lent, the Lenten season. And the word, by the way, has no religious significance at all. It really comes from the same root word as lengthen, and it's just about when the days seem to be lengthening because there's more daylight than darkness, especially in northern latitudes. That's how it got its name, but it's a period of time where in the history of the Christian community, people who were recent converts to Christianity in the Roman Empire in ancient days, they spent a time being instructed in the beliefs and practices of that Christian community, and then before they were admitted to full membership, they were tested on what they had learned about Christian beliefs and practices, not only in worship, but also in life. The Roman world in which the church grew up was one, really a pagan one, where in that particular culture, this is something that none of us can understand, but there were very rich, powerful people at the top, very few of them, and they seemed to have all the goods and all of the authority to do anything. And then underneath there were just these thousands and thousands of people who had almost nothing. Again, something that we can't understand. And in that particular culture, those who were at the top of the heap tended to be pretty self-indulgent, and they lived lavish lifestyles and often were quite insensitive to those who had not received the benefits of the bounty of that culture. Again, something that's hard for us to grasp that could even happen, but it was happening. This is a long time ago in a different place, naturally. The story of Jesus and his life and ministry is set in that culture. Though he was completely Jewish, but the Jews at that period of time were certainly people who were under the thumb of the Romans. And about 40 years after the life of Jesus, they would finally crush one of the last Jewish rebellions and pretty well obliterate as much as they could Jewish culture and religion. It was when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. But at any rate, the time of Jesus was a time in which there were some stark contrasts between those people who had the sense that they were people of God and people who were bound to the set of standards and practices socially that were, at least in their view, were acceptable to God. And even within the religious community, something that, again, we can hardly imagine happening, there were people who, on worship days, were there praising God and doing all of the right things religiously, and yet when they would leave the service of worship for the rest of the week, the lives that they lived certainly did not match the standards that they espoused. Jesus came into that culture, and one of the things that seemed to be remarkable about him was the way he followed what he understood to be the standards and practices of behavior that were acceptable to God, that were in harmony with the standards of the universe. And it's hard for us to prove that there is any force in the universe, whether you call that force God or call it nothing at all. But it's difficult to prove to anyone that love and compassion, concern for others, a passion for justice and mercy are somehow more in tune with the intent of the God of the universe, of the spiritual life. Though it's hard to prove that, one of the things that Christian people always remark about is how Jesus lived a life and called others to a life that was willing to serve and to sacrifice and to stand for what was right, as opposed to people in the culture who were willing to cut corners, willing to go along with the way things seem to have to be in order to get ahead, or just in order to keep their heads down and keep their heads attached to the rest of them. The Lenten season in churches that recognize and utilize some kind of biblical lectionary always begins with the story of Jesus being tested in the wilderness. The story appears in 3 of the Gospels, and it is, with variations, it's a story about what it means to be put to a test, to have your faith and your morality and your character tried and proven. And as those of you who've heard me speak before can imagine, I don't really take literally the sense that there is a devil. And certainly I would not go along with the notion that the devil is a horned beast that carries a trident. Those images make for good scare tactics. And I know a lot of people like to maintain power and acquire position using scare tactics. But I don't think there is literally a devil, but I sure have witnessed the presence of evil in the world. And we don't know whether this story of Jesus being tested in the wilderness, whether the one who's called the tempter is some force outside of him or something inside of him. I've had enough experience with my own sense of being tested on the basis of what's going on around me that I could believe the test comes from out there. But I've also had enough experience of my own internal struggle between right and wrong, between doing what one should and not doing what shouldn't be done, that I could also go with the idea that the tempter is an internal force. And I suspect in real life it's some of both. The other thing I'll tell you, in my belief, if there is any kind of a devil, the devil doesn't look scary. The devil doesn't look ugly. The devil doesn't look repulsive. The devil looks pretty good. And that's the dilemma, is it not? That what turns out to be evil so often looks so good, but it turns out to be the kiss of death. So Jesus is tempted to do some things, turn stones into bread, have all of the kingdoms of the world in his power. This almost sounds like a big test, and it was. And he passed. Because he didn't give in to what is a basic urge we are all tempted with. And that is the urge to use what power and authority one has for self-indulgence, for acquisition, for advancing one's own case and cause at the expense of others. And that's on the test all the time. I've done some teaching. I had a brief experience being a substitute teacher in an inner city high school with people who were 16, 17, 18 years old, still trying to pass sophomore English because they couldn't graduate if they didn't. And it was a rough crowd. One of the things they all wanted to know with anything that was taught, and I think they're like students everywhere, is this important? Will this be on the test? Now, I don't want to bother learning anything that won't be on the test. I don't want to bother being told about anything that doesn't count. And I found when I was teaching confirmation classes to young people, same kind of questions. Always gave them kind of a comprehensive test at the end of confirmation class, preparation for membership. And they would all say the same thing. What's going to be on the test? Which of those things that we covered of church history and the Bible and the standards for worship and practice of our faith community, which of those things are we going to be tested on? And the truth is, regardless of what you put on a piece of paper, regardless of what you ask in an oral examination, when you get out there in real life, it's all important. And it's all on the test. Because we are being tested every single day. And Mom would say, wait a minute. I don't have any power. I don't have any authority. I'm not part of the 1%. I'm part of the 99%. I don't hold elective office. I'm not the chair of the board of a congregation or of a corporation. No, I'm just a pawn on the board. I have no power, and I have no authority. Baloney. Every one of us has been entrusted with power and authority. Every one of us has been entrusted with gifts and graces of our own intellect, of our own character, of our own morality, of our own sensitivity to the world and the people in it. One of the tests that faced Jesus all his life, one of the tests that faces every person in leadership, whether it's in a nation or a church fellowship, every single one of us, as we live in our families, as parents or grandparents, we have authority and power entrusted to us. And we're constantly being tested with, how are you going to use that? What are you going to do with it? Throughout the biblical witness, there's story after story about people who abuse their power or people who don't use their power. I couldn't even go through all of them with you, and any that I mentioned would just have to be mentioned briefly. But there's a story about Pharaoh, king of Egypt, was with a nation filled by, well, they were immigrants. They were Hebrew people, and they were valued for the labor that they provided, and it was cheap labor because they were virtually slaves, though they had come as welcome guests and free people. But Pharaoh abused the power he had, and he forced people to labor for him. And he built this, well, we call it a pyramid, but it's kind of a tower, really. And they put his name on it. And these immigrant people that he had forced into labor, he really had no regard for them. And in fact, there was a point at which he thought there were too many of them. And this guy didn't just build a wall, he started killing them. And what the Bible story tells us is that is not consistent with the standards of the God who entrusts leaders with power and position. And we've got a parallel story in the time Jesus was a baby about a king called Herod, who started putting the children of the Hebrews to death because he was concerned that somebody else would rise up and become king of the Jews. And Herod was such a bad guy, he even put his own family members to death. The Hebrews put up a sign. It said, "Hebrew lives matter," but it was disregarded. They weren't important. Story after story in both the Old and the New Testaments of the Bible tell us that the abuse of one's power and authority is contrary to the will of God. It's contrary to the moral order of the universe. And if you're going to have power and authority, whether it's power as a parent, as a brother, as a sister, as a citizen, as a member of a religious fellowship, as a person in local government or national government, you better be a person who doesn't abuse your power and your authority for your own benefit, for your own self-aggrandizement, for your own profit, or even to please the people who put you where you are. You follow instead a moral code with courage and with rectitude. And if you don't do that, you are destined to destruction, and you will cause a lot of hurt along the way. Don't question that you have power and authority. Instead, accept the power and authority you have and utilize it in ways that benefit especially the good and the right and the compassionate and the merciful things of this world. Use your power and authority to stand with those who are outcast, who are friendless, who have no one to speak up for them, and no one who will stand with them and say, let's not let this persist. Churches are so good at charity. We have a harder time demanding justice for the poor, for the afflicted, for those who've been marginalized in a society. And those are the things that put us to a test. Are we going to stand for that which is the order of the universe, the will of God, whatever you want to call it? Are we going to stand there? Or are we going to follow other ways? Are we going to use our power and authority for our own benefit to the detriment of other people? Or are we just not going to bother to do anything at all? We're always being tested. And it's all important. And it's all on the test every single day of our lives.